Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. In this installment, I'll be covering The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, a new series on Netflix. The show is based on a graphic novel of the same name, and Sabrina, the character, has appeared in numerous media iterations over the years. Notably, the show borrows from the aesthetics of the graphic novel in a playful sort of way, and I think it's safe to say that this particular interpretation of Sabrina is considerably darker than previous versions. There are various aspects to the series that I personally find over the top and cheesy. It almost falls into the category of one of those guilty pleasure shows, but, I actually think the series is navigating some interesting terrain just in terms of its placement in the media landscape. Based on the premise and the general tone of the series, it's a show that you might expect to be on the CW. Interestingly, it seems to take place in the same universe as Riverdale. I would venture to guess that Riverdale's success is at least part of the reason why this show was greenlit. And just a sidebar here, Sabrina has a Christmas special coming up. I'm willing to bet it's going to be a Riverdale crossover, a sort of one-off adventure or something. If that's the case, I'm extremely here for it, and I will be double-fisting goblets of red wine when it airs. Anyway, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina is on Netflix, and the manner in which viewers consume media of this sort is a little different from the way we do with network television. In some ways, the show toes an interesting line between a serialized sort of supernatural thriller and a dramatic show in which the entire season constitutes a cohesive narrative arc. The balance is at times a little awkward, but it's a fun show. I mean, there's one entire episode in which each of the Spellmans become trapped in their own worst nightmares by this here demon lady. So what's not to like? It kind of reminds me of True Blood in that way. And I do think there's a bit more subtext going on in this series than one might expect just based on an initial viewing. So let's get into it. I'll be entering spoiler territory from this point forward, so if you haven't seen the show, you can go ahead and stop watching. In some ways, the series works to elucidate something quite perceptive about the way religion works, particularly the various institutions of organized religion. Now, it is important to understand that religions come about under particular historical and material circumstances. Yes, stories of a spiritual nature, perhaps regarding, for instance, the world and how it came to be, have been told across various cultures throughout history. But for these stories to become codified as religious doctrine, they need to be passed down from generation to generation, and they need to become prescriptions for a certain way of life. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with the validity of any particular religious beliefs. That's a can of worms for another time. All I'm really saying here is that religion is a product of society and should be understood on those terms. One really needs to ask what function such beliefs and doctrines serve in a given society. I find it interesting that in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, the Church of Night is depicted as the precise inverse of the Catholic Church. I mean, the crosses are literally turned upside down. The manner in which the holy becomes the unholy in the Church's formation of the satanic ideal is, in some sense, liberatory. The Dark Lord doesn't ask that his followers repent for their desires in the way that Christian doctrines generally prescribe. It's important to note that despite the considerable theological differences between the Church of Night and its Christian counterpart, the Church of Night is actually depicted as being quite similar in some respects, at least in terms of its emphasis on ritual and the bureaucratic structure of the church itself. The power dynamics at play in relation to the church's belief system is worth taking a look at. Interestingly, members of the church often refer to the Christian God as, and I quote, the false God. While Satan himself does make an appearance on the show, God does not. Maybe they're saving that for later. Nonetheless, one gets the sense that these beings, Yahweh and Satan, are not the source of good and evil in this world, but rather just powerful entities engaged in a centuries-long political squabble. Of course, no religion is entirely homogeneous. That is to say, no group is in universal agreement on every aspect of their particular doctrine and, to a broader extent, their culture. And while it's probably fair to say that the Church of Night is somewhat insular, the show alludes to a political shift that took place in the Coven during Edward Spellman's time as High Priest. It seems that he was trying to modernize the church, at least in some respects. By contrast, Father Blackwood advocates for a return to the traditional norms of the church prior to Spellman's reign. One might consider this to be a struggle between socially liberal and socially conservative elements of this particular coven. With Edward Spellman's conspicuously timed time death and Faustus Blackwood's current occupancy of the high priest position, it would appear that the conservative side of the church is currently in power. A very clear example of this distinction is the varying stances on a controversial ritual, the annual Feast of Feasts, in which a queen is chosen to be sacrificed and consumed by the rest of the coven. Spellman did away with the feast during his reign, and by contrast, Blackwood brought it back. In a certain sense, he's making the coven great again. Now, a charitable version of the conservative position is simply that they all need to stick together in order to survive, and the traditions of the church help serve that function. In this framework, all members of the outgroup are seen as dangerous interlopers. The logic of this framework breaks down when you think about it for about 10 seconds, but perhaps more to the point, one gets the sense that the conservative ideology espoused by Blackwood, and to a larger extent the institutional bureaucracy of the church itself, is just an elaborate means to consolidate power for a small handful of witches and warlocks, in particular the high priest himself. The political struggle of the church is embodied in Sabrina herself. As a half-human, half-witch, Sabrina is stuck between two worlds. The distinction of the in-group, the witches, and the out-group, the mortals, is central to the formation of the witch's social identity. In other words, the idea of witches is contingent upon the idea of mortals. It is only by defining themselves in relation to their differences and at times antagonism with mortal society that witches come to form a cohesive identity. But throughout the series, there are various indications that the witches actually have more in common with mortals than they might think. I would argue that Sabrina represents the possibility of a new and revolutionary epoch for this coven and perhaps witch society at large. It's an epoch in which the dichotomy between witches and mortals is de-emphasized and perhaps even eroded at some point. Above all, what is most apparent in the work in thematic terms is the oppressive nature of certain entrenched binaries, most prominently exemplified in the aforementioned distinction between witches and mortals within the fabric of culture. This thematic motif is further demonstrated in Susie Putnam's treatment by the jocks at Greendale High for not fitting into their restrictive preconceptions of the gender binary. On that note, it's worth mentioning that gender factors into the political landscape of the church in a roundabout sort of way as well. Ever the patriarch, Blackwood is dead set on his wife, Lady Constance, having a son so that he has a male heir to assume the position of high priest. This is despite the fact that he already has a daughter, Prudence, who, while illegitimate, can be thought to have some reasonable claim to this position. And if it is in fact the case that Edward Spellman was murdered as part of some elaborate conspiracy, then Sabrina herself has a rightful claim to this position as well. To complicate matters further, Constance ends up giving birth to twins, the first of which is a girl. Tragically, Constance dies during childbirth, and Zelda keeps this girl's existence a secret from Blackwood and the church at large. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the question of who is going to assume the position of high priest after Faustus Blackwood will be a central plot element in future seasons. Sabrina's connection with mortal society is largely encapsulated in her relationship with her boyfriend, Harvey. There's an obvious parallel between Sabrina's struggle and the pressure put on Harvey by his father to become a coal miner. Importantly, Greendale is a coal mining town. The death of Harvey's brother Tommy is an important plot point in the series, and I'd also argue that it's thematically important. In the long term, coal is not a viable source of energy. The coal industry is contributing to carbon emissions, thus spurring climate change, and cheaper, more environmentally friendly resources are on the horizon. But Greendale's entire economy is reliant on coal mining, and unless some other source of livelihood emerges, it's very likely the town will go the way of so many other factory towns in the US. That is to say, it will become a ghost town. Tommy, the firstborn son of the family, was considered by his father to be his legacy. And since Harvey is decidedly not enthusiastic about a career in the family business, Tommy is also considered to be the sole family member with the chance of keeping the mine in operation, as their father makes abundantly clear when he says that the wrong son died. Tommy's death signifies the death of a viable future, both for his family and for the town itself. Sabrina's effort to bring Tommy back to life is, of course, doomed from the very beginning. The peculiar sort of economy of souls that is spelled out in the series is worth considering here. The ritual that Sabrina carries out in order to resurrect Tommy requires another life to be taken so that balance is maintained. Sabrina tries to find a loophole in this ritual by murdering Agatha and then reviving her in the grave outside her home. But alas, when Tommy comes back to life, he's an uncanny shell of a person. His soul is trapped in purgatory. And tragically, by trying to circumvent the requirement of this particular ritual, Sabrina has only made things more difficult for Harvey. On the surface level, we might well write off this whole storyline as a clever reiteration of the whole "sometimes dead is better" lesson presented in Pet Sematary. But I think there's more to it than just that. The tit-for-tat nature of this ritual is indicative of a deeper thematic motif. That is, the dynamic by which power itself is commodified by Satan in order to control people, namely witches. For said witches, it's a simple trade-off. In exchange for complete and total subservience to Satan, you get immortality and other crazy powers. Sabrina wasn't able to save Harvey's brother precisely because she was trying to have her cake and eat it too. She didn't want to have to go through the act of committing murder, but she also wanted the power to resurrect Tommy. And after all, what greater power is there than the ability to make people come back to life? Just as the Church of Night is depicted as the precise inverse of the Catholic Church, so too is the hero's journey turned on its head in the first season. In fact, Sabrina is tempted by Madam Satan in the very same way that Luke Skywalker is tempted by Darth Vader in Empire Strikes Back, and later the Emperor in Return of the Jedi. Madam Satan even uses some of the same language.
It is your destiny.
Now, in Sabrina, the entire town is threatened by the return of the 13, along with the so-called Red Angel of Death. Importantly, the vengeance of the Greendale 13 is a product of an atrocity committed centuries ago. Madam Satan, on behalf of the Dark Lord himself, offers her the power that is necessary to save her family and friends and vanquish the 13. Unlike Luke, who throws his lightsaber down and offers himself up to be killed rather than turn to the dark side, Sabrina takes Madam Satan up on her offer and signs her name in the Book of the Beast. Notably, this is after an entire season of resistance to this very act. The Dark Lord lives up to his end of the bargain and gives Sabrina the power to conjure hellfire in order to annihilate the 13. It is only when she forms a pact with Satan that she's granted the power necessary to save her friends and family. Though, of course, this was Satan's plan all along. He's the very reason they were all in peril in the first place. As with the mortals and their reliance on coal, the witches' unconditional loyalty to Satan, the source of their power, is not a sustainable arrangement. And I would speculate that Sabrina's newfound power will come at an immense cost. We'll have to wait and see how it plays out, but I hope that at the very least I've shed some light on some of the deeper themes and subtext of the series. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. If you enjoy my videos and have a few bucks to spare, please consider supporting me on Ko-fi.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Any amount, large or small, would be highly appreciated. Thank you for watching, and good night.